Well, let's take this show on the road.
Perfect.
That was me clearing. Goedemiddag allemaal in België. Welcome. Very good morning for the people joining us today from anywhere in the US, the Americas, and in particular also our main speaker, Jeff Tingley, who's joining us from the East Coast. I think, Jeff, for you it's now 9 a.m. in the morning.
It is.
Aangegeven, very welcome. Very good to have you with us. Zoals aangegeven in de uitnodiging zullen we het event vandaag in het Engels voeren. I trust you're all okay with that, being in the export business after all, etc. So it's now 3 p.m. For you people, in the majority of the people in Belgium. I think we have a healthy turnout. People are showing up. We're expecting about 40 to 50 participants for today's session. The majority, or at least a good chunk of you, seem to have landed. So thank you already for your timely arrival. Now, in return, and respecting your time and agenda, I propose we start more or less punctually. I'll first set the scene and then run you through some housekeeping rules, and that will give the latecomers also a bit more time to join us. So once again, welcome. Thank you for tuning in today for this 1-hour briefing on the recent offshore wind developments in the United States. And indeed, there's a lot of information to share, as the industry seems to be on a roll and to have the wind in its sails, or should I say, blades. I should really acknowledge our partners organizing this with us. You can see their logos on this slide here, but a quick shout out to the good people at Cleantech Flanders, the Agoria Energy Club, Flux 50, the Blauwe Cluster, the Belgian Offshore Cluster, and Steve's and partner OWI Lab. And I hope I covered all of them then. Yes. So a big thanks for them for getting involved, and for reaching out, well, to all of you. Now, before I forget, my name is Moreau. I'm posted here in San Francisco since a few months now, so some of you may still know me as being Singapore-based, but I'm here now at the west coast of the US, still with my Flanders investment and trade hat on, and still focusing on climate and clean tech. Today, I will just be moderating this event, and in a minute, I will give the floor to our main guest, the expert speaker, Mr. Jeff Tingley, who I will introduce shortly. The fact that we have, well, the interest of about 50 people, I assume some will look at the recording later, and entities show interest in this topic really does tell us that there is indeed momentum. First, of course, and that's an acknowledgement to all of you, we have built this fantastic offshore wind story in the North Sea, not just off our own shores, but also in the UK, the Dutch, Scandinavian waters. And secondly, we see offshore wind taking off beyond those, well, dare I say, traditional fishing grounds. Even the French are getting into it, but also exciting markets such as Taiwan, and who knows, eventually Vietnam, Japan, Australia will eventually really take off. Now, the newest kid on the block is the US, I could say, but that would be basically be unfair. The US is not new to wind energy, with an installed base of, I think, well over 100 gigawatts onshore. And the US is also not new to offshore, with a very strong offshore expertise in oil and gas. What is new is this very clear, very strong focus on offshore wind. And I will not go into politics, but yes, this renewed focus coincides with the new Biden administration. However, it's a bit more complex than just this new federal president coming into office. There's also the role of the individual states, but I'm sure that Jeff will touch upon this as part of his briefing. Before I give him the floor, please note that today's session will be recorded, and the recording will be made available to you, as well as a slide deck. Jeff kindly agreed to various slides. Please put your questions in the chat, and we will group the Q&A at the end, and I will pick up those questions. Please know that the chat is not recorded, so you can really jot down any ideas, any comments in the chat session, and that will not be recorded. At the very end, I will also see where I am in my slide deck. I will come to this slide, which I will not touch upon now, but more of a teaser, which has some of the actions that are in the pipeline, and related to that, also a brief update of the COVID-19 situation in the US. Now, enough for me. Allow me to introduce you to our main speaker, Mr. Jeffrey Tingley. Now, Jeff is the head of strategy and market development at Xodus, not quite sure how to pronounce it, Jeff. You will have to enlighten me later. It's a global energy consultancy firm with a strong footprint in the US and active in advisory services, both technical, commercial, supply chain, you name it, in the energy sector. Now, Jeff had a very distinguished career, and most recently, before joining Xodus, he was part of the Rhode Island Commerce Corporation, the economic development agency of that state. And if you know where Rhode Island is positioned, you can imagine that offshore was certainly on his mind also when he was still with that agency. And I believe he was also even involved in the Block Island project by Ørsted. So he sat at both sides of the table, and he comes with hands-on insights in the industry. So with that, Jeff, I think I have set the expectations high enough, and we are very happy to have you with us. Thank you already, and I want to give you the floor and invite you to share your view on the industry and some of those recent developments. And very recently, things were in the press. So happy to learn your insights and to share your slide deck. Thank you.
Ralph, thank you so much. And thank you everyone for having me here today. I would like to, all right, let me just share my screen here. And what I'd like to, I hope all of you can see my screen. What I'd like to talk with you about this morning is really this.
Sorry, Jeff, I think you're not between your screen, but I don't really see your presentation yet.
Let me unshare. Share screen. Sorry about that.
No worries. Yes, there we are. Perfect.
Can you see that? Okay, I'm sorry about that, a little glitch. I'm pretty experienced in offshore wind, maybe not that much in technology, however. Well, Ralph, thank you so much for having me, and Lauren, and I'd like to also, what happened to my, sorry. I'm sorry, my deck just seems to have disappeared.
It did, yes.
Oh, gosh.
No
Share screen. There we go. Is that back up again now? Okay,
right.
great. And what I'd like to talk to you about this morning, I think you have to give me control.
I think you should be good. Can you just click on your slide? Yeah, and then we'll move forward.
Okay, so what, I mean, as Ralph mentioned in the beginning, the US has an offshore wind target of 30 gigawatts by the year 2030. Right now, that really is all concentrated on the eastern seaboard, and it really is moving from north to south. The most recent development is actually the approval of Vineyard Wind. That is the first commercial scale wind project in the US. There are currently 7 turbines installed. There are 5 in Block Island. Those are in state waters. And there are 2 off of Virginia, which are in federal waters. Both of those could really be considered test cases for the development of the industry. We in the US are probably 30 years behind you in Europe. However, with these energy goals, we'll have to catch up in 10. In that period that we're going to catch up, there is a lot of need for the expertise that companies from around the world can bring into the US offshore wind market. Also, just recently, California has announced that they are going to look at lease areas on the West Coast. What I'd like to do this morning is just review things regionally as to where they stand, some of the challenges, the lessons learned, and then after we go through all the regions, talk about really the best way to enter the US wind market and some of the areas that, excuse me, that need to be taken into account as you look towards entering our market. So, first of all, kind of a big overview. There is going to be about $80 billion spent in CapEx on the eastern seaboard in order to create these 30 gigawatts of wind. And I have a breakdown here of where it comes from. Not surprisingly, the bulk of it is in towers and foundations. However, what's very important about this is that a lot of work has to also take place on shore. So there are many opportunities for transmission, for grid upgrades, etc. These grid upgrades are going to be supported by our President Biden's infrastructure bill. Now, unclear as to when that will get passed, but the message here is that while there's lots of work offshore that has to take place, there's also a significant amount of work that will have to take place onshore. The combination of the approval of Vineyard Wind, when added to the infrastructure bill, with added to 11 construction and operation plans currently about to be approved, there is confidence that this industry is going to move forward, and it's going to move forward quite quickly. When you look at New England, where I'm based, we have a 10 gigawatt target by 2035. Having Block Island being the first wind farm in the water in the US, having Vineyard Wind being the first commercial wind farm approved, and also with a floating platform wind farm in the Gulf of Maine, we really believe that New England is sort of setting the pace. New England is going to be the test case for offshore wind in the US. And there are great investments taking place in ports. There are great investments taking place in vessel construction and in foundation locations. If you look at the chart underneath that, it shows sort of the progression. And what you see is a lot of this happening in the next 2 to 3 years. I think some of this schedule may shift a little bit out, maybe a year, but the industry is really on track to get these wind farms put in place very quickly. As you move down the coast, probably the largest area is the New York, New Jersey area. It's 16.5 gigawatts. It's 9 gigawatts from New York. It's 7.5 from New Jersey, but there are challenges there. One of the challenges is the New York, New Jersey labor market is very expensive. There is a great need for port infrastructure upgrades. Specifically, one of the main locations, which you may have all seen, is called Windport, New Jersey. That requires about $200 million US dollars of investment in order to upgrade it for a port. There's also the South Brooklyn Marine Terminal, which is being looked at as a major construction and marshaling port. And even the Port of Albany, there through the Empire Wind project, which is run by Equinor, there is a tower facility and foundation facility that's being built in the Port of Albany. There are some concerns about that because it is up the Hudson. It is about probably 100 miles of river down to New York. And therefore, there are some challenges about barging equipment in long distances. However, if you look at the totals of megawatts being commissioned, it is a highly desirable location due to the size of projects. What we find is that what the industry is looking for in the US is line of sight. So as people look to establish operations in the US, as companies that have adjacent technologies look to move into the offshore industry, what they typically look for, obviously, is how many projects can I do, not just individual projects. And so the line of sight of multiple projects is very important. And as you can see, these are very, very large projects over the next 7 to 8 years. And so therefore, very good line of sight. So this is an area that's very attractive to people. As we move down into the Mid-Atlantic region, we get into some of the bigger projects. It's 14.8 gigawatts by 2040. That was recently, that includes the recent announcement of North Carolina committing to 8 gigawatts by 2040. North Carolina has 3 lease areas: Kitty Hawk, Wilmington East, and Wilmington West. Kitty Hawk is already been leased by Avangrid. Wilmington East and Wilmington West are going out for lease next year. And importantly is the Coastal Virginia Offshore Wind Project, which is run by Dominion Energy, which is 2 separate wind farms. The first being a 2.5 gigawatts, which is expected to be done by 2026. Now, what's interesting about that is Dominion Energy is in fact a utility. So they are acting as both the off-taker and the developer. That, we believe, is a trend to watch in the US, is after the expertise is gained from Equinor, Ørsted, Avangrid, etc., Vineyard Wind, will the utilities themselves begin to be developers as well as off-takers? So that's a very interesting trend that is happening in the US that we're taking a look at. What this area has, and it's interesting when we start to talk about clustering, which I will do in a minute. The Hampton Roads area in Virginia is the US's largest naval base in the world. Therefore, it has deep water. It has a lot of adjacent industries. It has proximity to the Coastal Virginia project and proximity to the Kitty Hawk project, which is right a little south of Virginia in North Carolina, but serviceable. The point there is that as we look at ports and we look at clustering, the ports are going to serve multiple wind farms. There's also something that you may be aware of here, is that while these wind farms are in state waters, while these wind farms are in federal waters all up and down the East Coast, with the exception of Block Island, which is in state waters, that even though they're in federal waters, the states are the ones that procure the power. Therefore, every state has its own purchase agreement with a developer. Every state has its own conditions on which they grant that agreement. So there are things such as local content, meaning that if I in Rhode Island are going to buy power from Ørsted and give Ørsted a contract, I expect that X amount of dollars will be invested in Rhode Island, X amount of people will be hired, etc. So one of the challenges in the industry here in the US is that local content is determined by the state, and it's different state to state. So one of the concerns that the larger OEMs and tier ones have is if they establish a major operation in one state, how do they actually account for the local content in another state which their products will be supplied to? The reason I bring that up is that in the Mid-Atlantic region, North Carolina, Virginia, and Maryland, which are abutting states, have agreed through a memorandum of understanding to share local content. So what they're going to do is they're going to say, we as a region want you to put your business here, and we're going to figure out as 3 states how we're going to account for that local content across state lines. That's a very interesting trend, and that's another one to take notice of, because we believe that that's something that's going to happen up and down the East Coast. There's also a trending within local content where the early contracts were very specific about how many dollars, how many people, et cetera, within local content. The trend now with recent RFPs for power has been to say, you as a developer, you tell me what you can do to help the state. And so we think that is another trend which is happening as well. So those are really the three major areas on the East Coast that have actual projects with actual schedules. As you look to some of the other areas in the US, the West Coast is an area that many people talk about. California has just announced that they are looking at lease areas in 3 areas to establish offshore wind. There are real challenges on the West Coast, however. The water in the Pacific is very deep. State policy is just beginning to form right now. The coast, or the northern coast of California, which is where the proposed areas are not big consumers. The consumers of electricity in California tend to be from, San Francisco, then there's a big gap, but Los Angeles and San Diego. That area has a lot of military, and there's a concern about the Department of Defense and how air and naval operations can work in that area and coexist with wind farms. There is also a supply chain infrastructure gap. There is little existing adjacent industries to support wind farm growth. So the point here is that while the market is large on the West Coast, there's a lot of development that has to take place. And as I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of work that has to take place onshore. So transmission upgrades are going to be very expensive on the West Coast. So the levelized cost of energy will be high, although with investment, as part of that infrastructure bill I mentioned earlier, we believe that reductions are going to be anticipated, and that a renewable energy, meaning offshore wind, is going to become more attractive over the next couple of years. So it's an interesting market to keep our eyes on. We're watching it very closely. We think it's, however, several years out before there's actual sort of planned activity. The Gulf of Mexico is a very interesting area. As I'm sure many of you know, the Gulf of Mexico is a very large oil and gas platform area in the US. Much of our domestic oil comes from the Gulf of Mexico. As a result of that, the infrastructure there is quite strong. There's very good shipbuilding. There are very strong companies that know how to construct big steel structures at sea. The water depth is quite shallow. Therefore, it's a fantastic area, fantastic potential for offshore wind in the Gulf of Mexico, but also, frankly, to support some of the East Coast work, especially in offshore construction, especially in the retrofitting of vessels, CSVs, SOVs, et cetera, that need to support the offshore wind industry. I'm sure all of you are aware of a shipping regulation in the US called the Jones Act, which means basically that ships that go between ports in the US have to be US built, US owned, and have a US crew. Obviously, with a nascent wind industry, we don't have the vessels yet. Dominion Energy is actually building a jackup vessel in Texas. So there is the thought of retrofitting many of the vessels that have been supporting the oil and gas platforms into offshore wind vessels. Much of that work is going to come out of the Gulf Coast. The Gulf Coast also has inexpensive labor as compared to the rest of the country. So this is an area that we are also keen on looking at, and we are following very, very closely. And something that we believe partnerships can be formed in shipbuilding, offshore construction, steel, etc. So with that being in the backdrop, what does the supply chain look like? Where is it heading? Right now, we're really in sort of the pre-project stage where we believe that most of the expertise, at least for the next couple of years, is going to come predominantly from Europe. We don't have the expertise here. We're beginning to build our industry, but right now it's really going to be expertise coming from Europe. As we begin to get more projects, and as more projects get approved through the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, what's going to happen is that it's going to become apparent for cost reasons that the supply chain must be built in the US. As a case in point, by 2026, I believe, there are going to be as many as 300 turbines per year commissioned. That is something that cannot be, imported from Europe the whole time. So the supply chain is beginning to build itself. And by 2024 and beyond, we should have quite a strong local supply chain or US-based offshore wind supply chain. The point of all this is that the opportunity to get involved in the US market is really now. There are companies here looking for partnerships, looking for joint ventures. Developers are very anxious to build local supply chains. So the Ørsteds, the Equinors, the Avangrids, et cetera, are really looking locally to build a supply chain, are willing to invest, are willing to help those companies move into offshore wind, because there is this realization that the size of the opportunity and the amount of work that needs to get completed in a relatively short time has to be done here. So there's an intense focus on maximizing local content, and that really means local supply chain and job growth. And the states are great supporters of this. They will supply the training, the workforce development. They're aggressive about incentives for setting up operations. The states realize the economic gains that offshore wind can bring to their state or their region, and they are acting, accordingly. So the message here is the timing is good, and your timing is now. Another reason is if you look at the prices, these are contracts at a price per kilowatt. And you look at, they've gone from 16.3 cents, which was the first one awarded in 2015, to one of 5.8 cents. That's a huge drop in the price per kilowatt. Obviously, that means that efficiency has to be built in to not only the design, the operation, and the construction, but also in the maintenance. That's something you in Europe understand. That's another reason why there is this thirst, if you will, for expertise to come here and for expertise to help us in the reduction of prices. Many states are saying that their second or third RFPs for power cannot have a price that exceeds the current one accepted. So costs are not going to go up. Costs are going to continue to decline. And the only way that it can be profitable is building a local supply chain. So once again, another reason why the timing and the expertise that exists outside the US is very important and something that's looked at very favorably in here, and the states will do an awful lot to help you all be successful. So, as I talked about earlier, there's clustering that's taking place. Obviously, there's certain areas that are better suited for certain types of technologies. When I look at those, I'm looking at things such as operations and maintenance. I'm looking at foundations. I'm looking at the cells and blades. I'm looking at cables and also a construction and installation. If you look on the East Coast, these are the major ports of which industry is looking to. And they're stars on the map. If you look at those stars on the map, it becomes quite evident that any of those locations can serve multiple wind farms. And so that's what the large tier ones and the large OEMs are looking at. And now that there has been Vineyard Wind being approved, now that there are 11 construction and operation plans coming out of BOEM, now that the Biden administration has announced their infrastructure bill, there is confidence that the industry is going to move forward and move forward quickly. As a result, the major OEMs and tier ones are now really beginning to hone in on where they're going to locate. And so there are a number of different industries that we think are happening in various locations. For example, the Port of New Bedford is a purpose-built wind port. We believe a lot of marshaling. We believe a lot of operations and maintenance will be run out of New Bedford. Just farther south in Providence, it's going to be marshaling. Brooklyn, Albany, Windport, manufacturing. Hampton Roads, manufacturing and support. So we are seeing the industry look at various clustering options as a result of two things: available workforce, the adjacent supply chain to support their industries, because as we all know, if you bring a nacelle plant, a nacelle plant requires a lot of other businesses around it. So is there the possibility in that area, and can they get the workers? So the clustering is beginning to sort of form. It's quite fluid right now, but there is some clarity in clustering as we are moving forward. So we look at the wind farm in terms of basically seven areas. You know, the product development, wind turbines, foundation, cables, electrical structure, and then installation and operations and maintenance. And here is where we think the supply chain is in sort of each of those categories. For example, in project management, and I'll just, you will get this deck, so I won't go through it all, but just I'll highlight a couple of things. In project management, a lot of that is taking place in New England. The headquarters of all the major developers are in the Boston area. So a lot of that project management is taking place up here in the Northeast. Building, nacelles, nothing has been announced, but it looks like New York and New Jersey, due to its available land and also the size of available market, is sort of clearly looking like a good location. Jackets and monopiles, that's where maybe the Gulf of Mexico plays. So there are different parts of the industry that are looking at different locations based upon available land, workforce, adjacent industries, and the state programs to support them as they move forward. If you look at installation, the turbine is probably going to be done locally. So it's going to be coming from a central manufacturing location to a marshaling port, a marshaling yard, which will be close to the project, and that's likely New Bedford, South Brooklyn, or Hampton Roads. Also, the operations right now, it's coming out of here in the Northeast. There are opportunities for inspection, repair, and maintenance. Those will typically be local, but we think New England, New Jersey, and I would add Hampton Roads are probably where that's going to mostly take place from. So, how do you enter the U.S. market? Some key considerations if you're considering, moving here. First of all, a reliance upon an international supply chain, as I said earlier, cannot last for a very long time. Local is where the companies are where the developers and where that are buying the power are looking is very important. A couple of ways of looking at it. There's a lot of partnerships being formed and joint ventures. So identifying a likely candidate here that has the expertise in the market that with your expertise and form a that allows you to deliver the industry. The U.S. is a market, so you need to have legal.
Sorry, Jeff, I think your audio is breaking up a little bit. No, I think we got the point about the limitation on the relying on external partners, the need to move on to partnerships and joint ventures. Maybe touch upon the third point on the slide. I think that's where we lost you. No, I think we're sort of losing.
So,
no, it's very, very sketchy. Lauren, is it just me or is this for everybody? Just 1 second, Jeff. Let me figure this out. I think it's everybody has a bit of a issue with the audio at this point, Jeff. Maybe.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, you seem to be coming back.
Is it back?
No, not really. Sorry, Jeff. Maybe.
Let me do this. Let me
No, that's not really.
Can you hear?
No, not really.
Let me stop powering up and I'll share right back. Okay, I'll see if that works.
Okay. Maybe just to keep you entertained, I see there were 2 questions, and I know that a colleague of Jeff is in the call as well. So maybe we can ask Delia to. I see you have been answering the call, the questions. in the chat. Maybe Delia, can you pick up the first question that you also answered in the chat?
That hear me? Ralph, if you could ask Delia here, I'm going to ask Delia to continue.
Okay, I will do that.
Yeah. Hey, Delia, could you continue, please? I'm very sorry, everyone. I don't know.
There we
No
go.
Hey, Delia. That's why you have you're teaming up there. Because you covered a lot of interesting stuff, yeah. So thank you for that. And I had, as you were presenting it, I had some questions I was jotting down, and then you were touching upon them. So very comprehensive overview. Let's just give technology a bit of a rest, and then 2 questions in the chat. I'll ask Delia to maybe pick up those questions because she was answering them in the chat already, and then we can come back to you for the remainder of the slide, if Microsoft allows.
Okay. Hey, can you hear me at all?
Yes,
You
you're
sound
back
fine
actually.
now.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, okay. Well, shall I just continue then?
Yes,
and you can
let's do
see my
that, and we
screen?
can come back. Yes.
Okay,
You
great.
see your screen.
Okay, great. It's very important when you come into the US that you get legal and financial counsel. You know, as a country, we have a federal tax code, but also every state has a tax code. And so it's very important that as you establish an operation, you understand how to set that operation up. And that is really a goal to have legal representation and to have accounting and financial representation. I don't want to, scare people that everyone sues everyone. That's not the case. It's just very important to establish your organization properly, and meaning properly by the states you're going to operate in. And that's where legal counsel and financial counsel can be very helpful. Also, each state has its own economic development organization. Those organizations are absolutely golden for you. They can identify incentives, they can set up contacts, they can work out financial plans, there's grants, there's loans, there's training programs that you can have access. The states are there to help you. And in my experience, having been in one, but also dealing with lots of other states, these organizations really can be a tremendous asset in the speed at which you enter and the success of your entry. There are some trends that are happening in the US, which I think are very important. Matchmaking is one. The developers and the tier ones want to engage a local supply chain. There's absolutely no question. And they really want to find partners. And so the matchmaking operation between OEMs and local supply chain is being driven by state, by industry associations within those states, and those are programs that are readily available. What they will do is they will get you in contact with the right people in the right industries in a forum that allows you to understand the requirements of the OEM or the developer, the requirements of the state, and really aids in a very successful and focused partnership. The developers and the states are heavily involved in diversity, equity, and inclusion. We as a country are looking at the growth of offshore wind as a job opportunity for multiple groups across the country. And therefore, it is important as you start to look here to look at those elements, because the developers are looking at those elements. As a matter of fact, a case in point, the most recent Massachusetts RFP for up to 1.2 gigawatts of power, the way the RFP is going to be reviewed is 70% is on quantitative, 30% is qualitative. Much of that qualitative is the ability to hire a diverse workforce. There is also a trend here, which is upgrades. All this power that's being generated offshore needs to come into an old grid, let's face it. And so, as I said at the beginning of my talk, the amount of time and effort being spent to upgrade the onshore capacity is absolutely huge. And so there's a great opportunity there as well. I'm running at the end, so I'll be fast here. State incentives, as I mentioned earlier, have job creation incentives. They have grants. They have capital financing available. They have innovation grants. The point here is that there is money available to companies looking to establish an operation in a state to lessen the cost of entry. And that's where the state economic development organizations can be very helpful. So the key to success, you have to build a network, meaning you have to be here, you become a trusted advisor, and you obviously have the competencies that we are looking for. It's very difficult to do without physically being here, however. And so just to end sort of here, we look at what's the best way to sort of enter the market and what are the pathways. One is to obviously concept, which is what is the market size? What are you going after? What are the products? Based upon that and based upon a knowledge of the US market, we'll point to the type of organization that you want. We really think this is the key, a decision, and this is where people of those operations that don't do very well or take too long, we think what happens most of the time is they're not looking at what their organization should look like. So you take your expertise, the market needs, couple those, and find out whether it's a joint venture, a partnership, acquiring someone, being acquired, or not entering in a market. Then rationalize the right people to partner with or be a JV with. When do you want to enter? What are the locations? What kind of people are you going to need? And then you then move into the implementation because you've done all the work first. The location becomes quite clear. Your project clear. You know what you need to get started. You're setting some immediate goals and then execute and continue to review. We believe that this is really the right process, and it's one that many companies go through. We actually help many companies go through this, but if you do this properly, you're de-risking your decision at various points within the entry process. And that, I'm a little bit late, but I want to thank you all for listening and thank you all for spending some time. And I'm sorry about the technical glitch. I don't know what happened, but you know, something always happens, but we did get through. So I'd love to answer any questions that any of you have, or have Delia answer any questions. So Ralph, I'll turn it back over to you.
Excellent, Jeff. And that technical mishap, no worries. It was an important slide though, and I think you touched upon that. It's good that you came back to it because it's the partnershiping and how to go forward, and there's going to be some maturity and transitioning local versus foreign expertise versus local, and how they're going to coincide. Can you maybe stop sharing your screen and we can excellent. Not yet. Yes. So thank you for that. What I learned from your presentation is the shores of New England are basically the new North Sea of the United States. To be very blunt and cut a few corners there, but yes, that's where we're going to see the first project. I think the expertise that we have built up in the North Sea is going to be very relevant. It's interesting that you touched upon the developers and the utility companies are stepping in.
Yes.
Then, of course, that complexity, federal versus state, where the OCS, or the federal water the federal government leases, but then basically you have to rely on the state to give you to offer you or to come to an agreement. And I think there was some concern with some people in this call. I think also in previous discussion we had about the uncertainty that there is in that phase in between. And yes, we touched upon that infamous Jones Act. We're very familiar with that. As you may know, Belgium, we have, we're home to two of the larger, or if not largest, dredging companies that have moved big time into the offshore wind installation. They have their specialty vehicles, of course, DEME and Jan de Nul. And DEME actually found a way or complied within the Jones Act and was successful. A successful part as a subcontractor, I think, of the Vineyard project.
Something to mention there too. We don't even have enough barges. It's not just CTVs and SOVs and those and jackups. It's barges also. The barges that we have in the U.S. Are not large enough for some of these components. So there's an opportunity. It's not just big sort of billion-dollar ships. It's barges as well.
Yeah, thanks. It was actually one of my questions coming up about bottlenecks and risks, but I'll come to that. Maybe finally my wrap up from in my own head. The importance. I mean, that one slide, but technically went a bit haywire. But then you touched upon it on the last slide. That importance of having a local presence. To find those local partners and to formalize it properly, also to comply with to be part of local supply chain. I think is a very important aspect of being part of the U.S. solution. You can just go. Finding those partners, of course, there's a role for us. I mean, at Flanders Investment Trade, we have our 6 offices in the sense that I think once you formalize it, I think there's definitely a role for organizations and companies like yourself. So very happy that you pointed that out, and it's a very important aspect of it.
I mean, what we find, if I could just add on that just quickly, the companies that think they can fly someone over here once every 6 months and then go back home, it just won't work, because you've really got to be part of the network here. You've got to really create that network, and so you have to have representation locally. Okay, thank you. I have a few more questions, but I see there were 2 interesting questions in the chat. Delia already answered them in the chat, but maybe we can retake them and then put them for the larger audience, for those who are not following the chat discussion. Maybe the first one by Samuel Worty from NG Benelux. I'll briefly read it, and then Delia, I'll hand the floor to you. So the question by Samuel is your comment on US supply chain requirements. How will this work if local content is still based on state level? And what specific items such as accommodation units, offshore substations, etc., where the quantity of supply is not sufficient to create large-scale local content? I think, Delia, you touched upon this, but maybe you can take this one.
Sure, I'd be happy to. So basically, the response that I had basically stated that in the immediate future, a lot of, or the majority of the supply chain is going to be met with external content. So for the early projects, a lot of things are going to have to be brought in, but the opportunity is for external companies, European companies in particular, that have experience in offshore wind to get engaged at this stage, this early stage, to assist local companies in building the local capacity and expertise, so that as the industry matures, they will be able to supply local content. And with respect to offshore substations and smaller volume parts of the overall offshore wind project, it is expected that more and more of the supply for those items will come from the United States with time, but as it makes market sense for it to be built out. So really now is the time for companies to engage with US companies, filling gaps, identifying efficiencies, helping with those qualification processes to kind of get a foot in the market. And then with that established local presence, they can then contribute to local content as the industry becomes more mature. So I hope that answers the question.
Okay, thank you. Maybe Jeff, one question for you. You mentioned it, and it was widely in the press also, the vineyard as being the first one getting the green light to basically go ahead, also by these maybe previously going to be impolite, somewhat obscure agencies like BOEM, etc., that have been dusted off and now this very prominent and important role to play. So can you just highlight the importance of vineyard going through, and I mean just relatively long timeline it took for this approval, and how that's going to potentially benefit previous and upcoming projects?
I'd be glad to. That's a great question, Ralph. Basically, just a time frame is from the time a lease area is established to a spinning turbine is about a 10-year period currently. Vineyard is the first commercial scale wind farm in federal waters. The approval cycle that it's gone through and the significance for the industry moving forward is, for example, it's set turbine spacing. The turbines are 1 nautical mile apart. It set a grid pattern. And so that grid pattern has been approved by the US Coast Guard, by BOEM, by all the stakeholder groups. The result of that is now the industry knows sort of the criteria that wind farms should be configured in because it's already been approved. That's number one. Number two, with the Biden administration, more investment has been made into BOEM with people. A lot of the delays have just been a construction and operation plan is about 1,000-page document. And so there's just been this bottleneck of work. So BOEM is now hiring more people to move those projects through. We believe that the next one will be South Fork, which is off the coast of Long Island. And then there's Revolution Wind, which is a Connecticut, Rhode Island project. Then you go to Empire Wind. And so the establishment of criteria of which BOEM gave its approval is now something others can follow. And we believe the process is going to be shortened on that end. We also have learned a lot. It's lessons learned, right? You have a lot of stakeholders. You have environmental stakeholders. You have coastal resources stakeholders. You've got fishermen as stakeholders. You've got shipping companies as stakeholders. Having worked all through that for Vineyard Wind establishes a game plan, if you will, for the other plans.
Yeah, thank you. That's indeed what our perception was, and it's good that you validate that point of view. I think a lot of homework was done, as you pointed out, all those different aspects, and hopefully that 1,000 pages, a lot of it can now be recycled in a way. A lot of uncertainty has been off the table now with that first project being formally approved.
Right.
And once again, happily that we have that dozen content in that first vineyard project. Maybe I'll go back to the chat. There was a question by Peter Jan van Buggenhout. He asked about the recently announced New York, New Jersey bight area, I assume he's referring to. How does that fit into the projects that you mentioned in the states of New York and New Jersey?
Well, that the New York bight is obviously a huge area. It's actually comprised of four different. It's actually comprised of 4 different lease areas. Right now, and Delia, correct me if I'm wrong, it's in the environmental stage right now where it's being evaluated. The leasing round has not been opened yet. It's coming out. When's it going to be leased, Delia?
I'm not sure exactly when the lease is scheduled to be actually issued, but they have had the preliminary notice of sale, so it should be forthcoming.
I think it's in the 4th quarter, if I'm not mistaken. That will be a lease area. Now, what's interesting about the New York bight, and this has just happened in Ireland actually, where Amazon bought the power. I would think that an interesting thing to look at with the New York bight is who will bid on that. Is it going to be bid on by power companies? Yes, obviously. Will there be some new players in there? We think so. Will it also be bid on by companies? This is an interesting thing, a trend that may be happening here. And so we're keeping our eyes on who's going to actually bid on that. So the New York Bight is going to be a very interesting test case because it's very large. And as I said, it's in four separate areas. One of the areas has very fertile scallop beds. So there's going to be some contention around that area. As you get in the Northeast, the fishermen and the fishing industry becomes more important because so much of the world's catch comes from sort of New Jersey northward. Not that big a deal in the South.
Okay, we're running slightly a few minutes over. I think that's fine because it's still interesting questions. I'm gonna leave the chat for this. We'll come back to the questions here and other those questions. Maybe one maybe naughty question for you, Jeff, to wrap up is we have seen Cape Wind in the past. And we know that I know I said it was a naughty question.
No,
we know that didn't
question.
exactly go as planned.
Right.
So what have we learned, and what is different now? Why do we think Cape Wind will not happen again?
Okay, here's a couple of things, and that's a really good point. And Ralph, thank you. I should have talked about that. Here's where Cape Wind failed, and this is opinion but backed on fact. Cape Wind did not manage stakeholder engagement at all. They thought they could.
Maybe Jeff, a bit of background for people who don't know what Cape Wind is about and context and the timeline.
In about 2000 probably 2010 or so, there was a project to build wind turbines off of Cape Cod, and they were only going to be 5 miles off of the coast. There is a lot of very expensive property in Cape Cod of people that look out over the ocean. And so there was a concern about the viewing of the wind farms from places like Hyannis, which is where the Kennedy family has their compound, as an example. They then went and said, we're just going to build it. They didn't talk to fishermen. They didn't talk to environmental people. And as a result, they did no stakeholder engagement until they got resistance. The trend now is to start with stakeholder engagement very, very early in the process. And so the main lesson learned from that is that stakeholders are important. Stakeholders are critical. I mean, basically a well-organized environmental group can really sort of stop a wind farm, and probably in many cases rightly so. And so the goal is really early stakeholder engagement. The goal is to work with multiple stakeholders in order to find the common ground amongst many of them to, in fact, deliver a project that's acceptable to all. So the main lesson learned is stakeholder engagement is very important, and you have to start early, you have to listen hard, and you have to be flexible.
Thank you. Yes, I think, and we have seen, of course, there's a lot more people and stakeholders involved now at all different levels, which makes it complex, but of course makes it more viable that a project will indeed be in the end a turning windmill. Jeff and Delia, thank you very much for your contribution and for all your insights. I think it's very much appreciated. There's many more questions coming, but we'll take them offline, and then we'll get back to them in a written form. In the interest of time, I think we will have to. Sorry, Jeff.
I was going to say, Ralph, I will send you the presentation and you can distribute to the group. On the last page of that is my contact information. Should anyone have any specific questions, I'd be more than happy to help.
You were very comprehensive, but I saw indeed there was a lot more information on your slides that people maybe want to take a bit more time to read to and in detail.
I didn't want to bore you for 2 hours.
No, it was perfect. It was actually perfect. Thank you.
I did my best answering questions in the chat while the presentation was going. So, but anybody that has more questions, they can reach out to us. And
great,
I'm sure they will. As I promised in the beginning, there's just one more slide I want to show. There's more from our internally for the audience, some practical information. I'll try to bring that slide up again. That will only take a few minutes. It's actually this one. It's a timeline of items coming up. I think yes. First one is of course. It's not so much coming up is the COVID-19 situation, but I will touch upon that at the last bit. So if you look at what's coming up for where we are getting involved or what's happening in the US, well, maybe related to COVID-19 while it's there. In the US, COVID-19 situation is, dare I say, more or less under control now. We see numbers dramatically dropping. Vaccination rates are high. The aim was to get at least everybody one shot, or 70% of the population one shot by July 4th, I think. They're just shy of making it, but yeah, we see a huge impact of the vaccination effort, which is going well. Let's put it like that in the US. That said, the different states in the US are opening up. Like I think almost all states have now more or less dramatically relaxed or are fully open and back up to business, like California opened up on the 16th of June, just a week ago, and we see the local economy booming. So we really see people are very eager to travel. That said, we know that Europe has more or less opened the borders for tourism for US citizens. What has not happened yet, and I think that's the point I wanted to come to, is the US has not opened yet its borders for free travel, business travel, or tourism travel for Europe. So that's still on hold. However, there is a regulation, and it's called an NIA. It's an exception you can apply for in the national interest exception. It's basically if you have a certain business interest, you can apply for a grant to travel to the US. This is being tested, but we know people are getting these kinds of acceptance to travel to the US from Europe. Then you see three more deadlines or dates on my slides. The first big one is IPF, which is the big offshore wind event of the year. It's happening in Virginia. No surprise there.
Right.
And I think it's the place to be, and especially August, it will be an in-person big event where everybody will be, given the momentum and everything that's up in the air, all these projects, all these partnerships being formed. It's really the place to be. We, as basically the Blauwe Cluster, has organized a trade mission in that week. So they will organize from meetings before, and they will also be there at IPF as will fit as we will be ourselves. So it's an important date to put on your calendar, and I think it's a realistic date also given the COVID-19 situation to maybe be there. So do consider that event. And secondly, the big event happening in October 21, so this autumn, is the Belgian Economic Mission, the large Belgian Economic Mission headed by Princess Astrid and a whole bunch of VIPs and ministers of all different colors and at levels that will be traveling to the US. And we will be visiting Atlanta, Boston, and New York City. Now, in the context of offshore wind, of course, Massachusetts, Boston, you heard Jeff talk about all those ports and important places where capacity will be built, is a very important one. And then, of course, New York and very adjacent New Jersey are also important players. So from our side, we will be focusing on organizing events, site visits, partnership visits in the during the Boston and New York leg of the mission. Now, you see there 2nd of July, and there's a reason we organized this briefing today, because 2nd of July is actually the deadline to enroll for that mission in October. I know it's a very early deadline, but if you want to make it or you even consider it, I would urge you to enroll and make the deadline. The cost to participating is relatively low, and if you cancel, you get basically your money back. So there's really no reason, if you're interested in the US market, in offshore, you're partly considering joining the mission, please do make the deadline of 2nd of July. And based on the companies and the critical mass that we see, we then also know better what to organize and what we can do for you and with you in that October deadline. So if you have any questions about this, about presentation, about those two big events coming up, IPF in August, it's the third week of August, I think, the week of the 24th, and the mission is the first week of October, so from 2nd to the 9th. And you can basically pick and choose the cities that you will participate in. So if you think Atlanta is less interesting for you, you can still join the Boston and New York City part of the mission. So with that, I want to wrap up. We're running a bit over time, but I apologize for that. I hope it was interesting enough to justify those 12 more minutes. I want to thank you very much again, Jeff and Delia, for your contribution. And thank you for tuning in today. And if you have any questions, do reach out to us. And have a nice day. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much, Ralph. Thank you.
You too.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Take care. Bye.